All right, welcome folks to our November Fireside Chat. I'm Kirk Hansen, the Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group. And if you have not attended a Fireside Chat before, this is a monthly Zoom-based meeting that we have where we cover a broad range of topics relating to small woodlands management. And tonight we're going to talk about beaver habitat restoration. We've covered a broad range of topics in the past, got a lot coming up in the future. And the offer we always make to you is if there's a particular topic that you want us to cover during a future fireside chat, please put it in the chat and we'll take that into consideration. The way that our fireside chats typically work is for the first half hour, we have a presentation on a particular topic. And then the second half hour, we open it up to public discussion. It could be question and answer between the attendees and our guest speaker, or it could be folks sharing their own anecdotes. But overall, the whole event is very informal. I would ask that if you have any questions or comments during the first half hour, that you put them into the chat. And what we'll do first when we're done with the presentation is take a look at those questions, field them, address those, and then open it up to a general conversation after that. So to get started, I would like to introduce a colleague of mine, Luke Lamarche. Luke, you and I met a long time ago, I realized. Gosh, it's been, I had to look up the forest management plan that I worked with you on for your land. That was 10 years ago, January 2014. And Luke, at that time, I think I met you. You were doing real estate appraisals, residential appraisals, and were appraising my parents' house. I think you're doing that to pay for your ecological forestry habit at the time. You acquired about 120 acres of forest land a little bit south of where my land is in Oakville. And I got a chance, the privilege to hike all over that with you, get to know you. And you've had a fascinating career ever since then, focused on environmental restoration in the past few years, working specifically on beaver habitat restoration. Um, I've been eager to get you onto a fireside chat. Luke came out to my Bakota forest maybe about a year ago because I'm having some beaver issues there and consulted with me on how to cohabitate with beavers in that context. And I'm going to share uh, some ideas I have about that project with folks once we're done with the meeting. But with that as a fairly loose introduction, Luke, I'd love to turn it over to you to further introduce yourself and then talk to us for the next half hour about the work that you do in with beaver habitat restoration and why small woodland owners should find that valuable.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Kirk. Um, yeah, it's been a long road for me. I didn't ever expect to be here. It's a niche little world, with only a few practitioners doing what I do on the West Coast, but it's a tight family that is pretty well networked, and there's been a lot of information sharing across this world. Um, which I benefited from a lot. So I've got um, a history of care for these systems that do reach back to being a forest steward. And I did buy some land here in Lewis County in '05 with a couple of friends and started just being inspired by permaculture practices, and really quickly, um, via a lot through my contact with you, Kirk, and your time at Wild Time, and my exposure to John, um, but mostly just listening to the forest in my space. I started doing pre-commercial thinning with a silky handsaw. My first 7 acre NRCS grant I mostly did by hand because I was a glutton for pain. Um, but then eventually did a couple more thinning grants, slash management, habitat piles. Got into uh, definitely acquiring a whole quiver of saws, and really watching my young forest that was clear cut in 95, but not replanted. So we got a real diversified stand come back. And so I learned a lot about water. And in that process, eventually made the heart move to dedicate my life completely and professionally towards restoration efforts and started out in big machines, building ponds and terraces and being high tech. And through that process, met folks and found beaver and the story of beavers. And um, yeah, and essentially found that their place in the landscape was uh, proven and that their relationship with the other species as a keystone species themselves and their history of being practically eradicated had a higher intrinsic potential for restoration than what I could see operating excavators and running high tech, high dollar machines, complicated processes that didn't have stewards built into them and weren't proven in the same way that um, beaver had been in the habitat. So that's my quick little narrative. I think I want to speak through a little presentation that I prepared for you guys. So I'm going to do a screen share here. Um, and bring up this presentation. Everybody see that?
You bet, it's working.
Okay. All right. Back and forth. Okay. This chat is going to be about coexistence. And that is the industry phrase that we're using. And it's different than a lot of things that you guys have, as landowners, might have seen. Um, with respect to doing restorative efforts, which is something that I also practice, but not as Beaver Craftworks. And that is installing BDAs, um, leaky weirs, pals, and a lot of that more like acting like beavers. So human being beavers is a whole different approach than what I'm going to talk about today. I love that conversation. It's something that I've been practicing on my land longer than I've been working in coexistence. But it's kind of a separate chat. And there's a lot more people involved in that. If you guys want to go down that road, um, there's folks working locally around here and all across the country and planet employing those kind of process-based restoration techniques that you'll see with Branch Solutions and a whole bunch of folks. A lot of conservation districts around here are starting to do a lot of those practices, and you'll see a lot of private landowners doing similar. But this chat is about working in support of actual beavers. And that is something that once I started to learn about beavers, and was struggling essentially with wondering how we're going to survive on this planet, um, and what's the best way for me to invest my efforts. I had a lot of questions, and this question was posed by these two fellas, Dan Penn and William Toms. They're cultural outreach officers with the Chehalis tribe. Um, and yeah, you can read it on site. They're asking, how do we ensure a resilient landscape for our future? One that benefits species, systems, economies, and our communities. And uh, when I learned that beaver were here before our culture was here, our Western European culture, um, and that their presence, had hundreds of millions of beaver on the landscape, um, and had effectively built a lot of the infrastructure that the salmon were using to reconvey all of that sedimentation and all those micronutrients that were being lost into the oceans, and that the salmon were the mechanism for restoring the upland habitats. And how does a system that's constantly eroding ever get replenished with those micronutrients? And so those huge migrations of fish upstream annually in these regions. Of course, that's not happening in the plains or something like that. But here, when we have these ocean run rivers, um, it's you guys might have seen this, but there's a saying that beaver taught salmon how to jump. And and I was a civil engineer. I was a Seattle U graduate at the undergraduate level on a swimming scholarship. And so starting to unpack this intrinsic potential and see what their game was, it realized that they had really been knocked back by the fur trade in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but that their populations were rebounding a lot. I was like, oh man, this is my game. This is my story. I'm getting on board. And so that's how I kind of found this world. Uh, and it's there's a lot of growing to do. We have a lot of learning to do. It's a young industry. There's a lot of tricks, but they're not proven. They're largely proven on the East Coast with Atlantic fish habitats and in a really different story. So they're powerful. Our fathers and grandfathers didn't have this problem. There's a shifting baseline. Their populations have been charging in the big water bodies where life is easy for them, food is abundant, security is abundant with a lot of water, and they're moving deeper and deeper up into the capillaries of the system, up into the tributaries. And that happens to be where we wanted to build and built a lot of low-lying communities in areas that had been forever managed by beaver. So invariably, what we're starting to see is a lot of conflict. This is a grove of 100-plus-year-old white oaks that are just wiped on a really picturesque high-dollar golf course. Um, Here is a side by side with some agricultural scenes just west of Portland, where Clean Water Services got these great ideas to restore habitat, plant a bunch of native species on low gradient systems, and a lot of folks don't realize that that's a calling card for beavers. And beavers will just be like, great, we'll take this and we'll run with it right from here. And now a wheat farm or a rye farm adjacent is going underwater, and it's bad for the bottom line when you're representing that farm. So also culverts is just a huge point of contention for municipalities, but a lot of private landowners. I'm sure a lot of you guys have creek crossings of different sizes running under service roads on your lands and forests. And to a beaver in a situation like this, we've pretty much built them a perfect dam and left out just this one tiny little hole. And they're like, thank you very much. Well, we can take care of that hole for you. But that is a huge point of contention where culverts that have been running fine for decades now have obstructions. Um, and this is like urban areas. million-dollar commercial complexes with critical parking lots getting flooded. Um, so what do they do? Um, so yeah, this is a document that was released last year. That's my mentor in the red dry suit out there, working this pond leveler. That's me in the foreground. He was the principal author of this Best Management Practices. This is a free publication online there at projectbeaver.org. And this is kind of a consolidation of like what's the state of the art in methods to coexist with beaver, from a flow device standpoint. What kind of ways can we deal with them in this coexistence way? And it's a partnership between Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, a bunch of contractors, a whole bunch of folks collaborated on this document. So you can check that out. Um, there's been a lot of folks. A lot of cities are coming up with management plans. State of Washington just had a preliminary meeting to just be kind of like, we need a plan. This is real. And we can't keep dealing with this whack-a-mole. The system realizes that this is a powerful upswell of energy, and we're not a bunch of burly French trappers that just want to go out and kill them. There's no money in furs, no, and we're now shifting over being more like these beaver actually were pretty great. So there's the human culture has changed since the fur trade. And so this is a document, an amazing document for landscape designers, but also in habitat restoration, written by Jen Vanderhoof, who is an awesome landscape architect up in King County. Also a free publication on their website, if you guys want to go a little bit deeper. But I'm just going to go through quickly, and not spend a lot of time in technical details, though I could spend all night on them. It's where I nerd out, as an engineer and a builder. But I'm going to just float through the kind of usual suspects in how we treat different conditions. Every site is a case by case. Watersheds all look different. Ponds, the situation is very, very different. But here are the typical strategies. Pond leveler. When there's a beaver dam and it's flooding, this is a simple and pretty proven device, provided there's enough water, um, where we will run a culvert pipe that is sized to carry normal flows, and we'll set a notch in the dam and run the pipe through the notch to the downstream side, and then that go up and the pipe runs upstream into the impoundment of the dam. And a steel cage is fabricated around the inlet so that when the water levels rise, the water starts to flow through the pipe. The beaver build around it, but they don't get any more gains on their builds, and we can control the height of their dam without excluding the beaver. So that needs to be set right so it doesn't push the beaver out, by looking at where their den is. If this is a primary dam, we need to make sure that we don't threaten the entry of their dam. They have underwater front doors that keep them safe from predation. So that's kind of where the site analysis comes in. How much do we have to give? What do the beaver need? What are the limits of the people? Let's talk. This is an installation in downtown Centralia at Centralia College, on the install day with a 15-inch pipe. And here is it a year later, all grown in, and flowing with summer flows. This is a private forest, that was just getting ready for a big harvest, in Deer Island, Oregon. Super deep pond. This is slam dunk pond leveler habitat. Nice, huge pond, big deep water. I can give you a guarantee that this is going to work. In shallow waters where the channel is narrow and it dries out every year, the risk goes up. And that is something that needs to be understood when you go into how do I deal with this. That's where experience comes in. Here's a different shot of that same leveler already sunk in. There's the landowner, with his little side by side, and that road was being threatened. The beaver were building the dam up and threatening to overflow the road and wash out his brand new road right before a harvest. So for a couple $1,000s, everything stabilized. He loves beaver, didn't want to kill him, knew that more would show up, so it worked out there. This is what we're considering on Kirk's land, where we don't have a lot of water, but we have a big open body in front of it. A trapezoid fence can be a great way to protect a culvert, or a crossing. So Kirk's got like a more of a like a box culvert. We can build them wide. This just uh, is a design that is just kind of takes in biology and has learned through iterative process that if you fully protect the culvert with a fence, including a floor, they're amazing diggers. They'll go right under a fence line. Fully floored, welded wire fence that's reinforced, and you shape it like this, like a trapezoid, the beaver will start to build where the water's flowing most quickly, adjacent to the inlet of the culvert. But as they start to build, the shape of the fence is pushing them outwards into the body of the water. So they're going into deeper water, they're going farther away from the flow of water in two directions, and all of a sudden they're not getting any gains on their builds. And the source of water is farther away, and they give up. I mean, they should give up. Um, so that's how this works. This is one protecting a culvert at a Boeing facility. That is an awesome story. Katie Holzier, if you guys want to hear an amazing beaver success story where a multi-million-dollar engineered water restoration induced meander bioswale system got flooded by beaver, and this engineer had been doing water quality there analysis for years. And after beaver flooded the entire thing, they're all really worried that it was a problem, but the water quality went up. The quality improved. And so she's got a really great story to tell there with a lot of data, and so that has hit hard. Plus, she's a PhD, so she really can talk the talk. Um, Here's one at Portland Community College at a storm drain facility protecting a 3-foot culvert. Really basic, simple design. I love this one because it's simple. There's no plastic, um, and it's relatively eloquent. Um, when we have shallower systems in creeks, more likely very common in more forested areas where everything's a lot tighter, we can build a tight fence around the culvert. And if the water upstream needs to be controlled, run a pond leveler through that and hide the intake. And that's another way of protecting culverts. So this is the first one that I ever built, also for a private forest owner in Banks, Oregon. It's actually the first one I ever built. Um, that is working great still today. Um, and this is the most recent one that I built for a storm drain facility for the city of Beaverton. They're just a lot of municipalities find that I get called very frequently when they've tried to kill or they've tried to relocate, and the kill strategy is more cumbersome than it seems. And there's rivers feeding new beaver into the situation. They buy themselves some time, but the administrative cost of, oh, we got a problem again. Okay, what should we do about it? Send a crew out, and then constantly fight the beaver who just will rebuild every single day. And so that is exhausting for a lot of public works directors and such. And so anything to stabilize that situation typically pays off. So um, fish passage is a concern. It's a lot bigger of an issue for us here on the West Coast. And so there's been a lot of back and forth with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and here in Washington, they do it differently, and have different opinions. But right now, everybody's got an opinion on what fish passage is all about. And there's no final word. There's no proven science on the deal. Um, but fish passage is a legitimate concern. And so when migrating anadromous fish are moving through a system, what kind of fences can you build? Um, are pipes considered fish passable? Um, we've struggled a lot in Oregon in the early years because the fish passage director thought that these things needed to be considered fish in the fish ladder program, and then they just didn't satisfy that, and essentially they didn't have a box to put it in, and we just had to just be like essentially talk. It just was a really long back and forth. And now there's a new fish passage director, and he's a millennial, and he thinks these things are very different than what his predecessor did, and so it's on the move. But in this situation, instead of having fences and welded wire, we can just set in an anchor dam, what we call an anchor dam, and that is just steel posts or wood posts, if that's the protocol. And we'll just, instead of fully protecting the culvert, we'll just put a dam pretty damn close to it, and put a pipe through that. And if you just would believe it, the beaver just take to the dam. Um, it's higher risk, but when fish passage concerns from Fish and Wildlife are just like, this is your only option, it's worked. This is just that going under Highway 26, heading west out of Portland, in Cedar Mill, and 3 years. And the beaver haven't marched over that little dam and plugged that culvert again, which is good because that culvert is like 100 something foot long culvert underneath the highway. So it's working. Yeah, keep working. Yeah. So, almost my last slide here. Um, we're riffing. There's a lot of riffing happening. There's a couple different conferences that happen every year. BeaverCon, um,
Luke, we have a glitch in the matrix here. You're frozen on your end. We lost you at BeaverCon.
uh,
Give,
uh,
give you a moment for your bandwidth to smooth back out again. Zoom technical difficulties. And there he goes. Well, I think while we're waiting for Luke to rejoin us, I'll shift to a personal anecdote that I was going to share about beaver coexistence, and Luke alluded to a project on my family's land, or one of our forests that we have near Bakota, Washington. He came out and consulted on this. So I'm going to share just a couple slides and show you an example of a project that's entirely in conceptual design right now. And I think I just learned one key design feature from Luke's presentation that I'm going to have to take into consideration here. Let's see if I, there we go. Moment. Okay. So the issue that I'm facing with beavers on, well, at least on the access to my Bakota forest, this is an access road. It's actually an easement to access across a neighboring property. The neighbor owns a wetland as part of a much larger forest ownership, and access into my Bakota forest is across the wetland portion of his property. And you'll see this wood deck bridge. So it's not a culvert underneath that. It's just wood, kind of heavy laminate wood beams on top of some ecology blocks. It essentially creates a short bridge. There's about a 10-foot span or so of water that flows underneath this bridge. You can see the wetland. This is upstream. And the beavers every year build their dam right underneath this bridge, back up the water. And then at this time of year and all through the winter, as this wetland backs up, it flows over the road, washing out the gravel and creating some access problems. Um, so we have done various things to try to address the beaver. We've pulled the bridge off, scooped the dam out, done that a couple of years. The neighbor finally just put this hog panel fencing, as you can see here on the upstream side of the bridge. But all the beavers have done with that is just build their dam right behind that fencing and effectively plugged up again the upstream side of the bridge there. I had a neighbor just recently come in, pull out their dam again with a mini excavator to get the flow coming through here. But the two things that I don't like about this system is one, every year we've got to come in and pull their dam out, which is both, expensive for us and of course disruptive to the beaver. So I had Luke come out and consult on this, and he recommended a trapezoidal uh, beaver deceiver design, which looks something like, let's see here. Oops. This, you probably saw this image or a similar corollary to this that Luke showed. Rather than a culvert, again, we've got the bridge on this side. And the idea behind this is that the water flows through this metal fencing, and the beavers end up building their dam, if they still decide to build a dam here, along the edges of the fencing. But water still is allowed to flow through the fencing and through the culvert, or in my case, the bridge. And so this is a design that I'm contemplating. And a few kind of interesting design features as I've begun researching this kind of system online. Here are some design specifications for the trapezoidal fence that I've found online. So again, the 8 feet is roughly the span of the bridge or the flow of water underneath the bridge. And the total perimeter of the fencing from the designs that I've looked at should be around 40 to 50, at least 40 to 50 feet. Apparently that creates enough surface area that it discourages the beaver from building their dam the entire way around that perimeter. And then the length of the sides should be two times the width of the stream crossing. So in my case, if I've got an 8-foot stream crossing here, or stream opening, however you want to look at that, then the sides should be 16 feet. Otherwise, they should be at least 12 feet long. And the fence panels should have a 6-inch wire mesh. And this allows the beavers still to swim through the fencing, but they can't carry their sticks through it, to build their dam, in this case, again, underneath the bridge. And then lastly, that fencing should set about 2 feet higher than the water level. And that, of course, then allows the water level to raise and lower throughout the season. So the one feature that I've learned from Luke's presentation that I hadn't considered in this is putting a floor on this. Like he mentioned, the beavers can just apparently burrow right underneath the fence there, and I'm assuming bring their debris with you. Luke, it looks like you've rejoined us again.
Yeah, hey, I did.
I
I'll keep
decided
my
just to
video off, but
You bet. I just decided to share the design that I'm starting to piece together based on some of the ideas that you've given me, and some research that I've done online. So I'm not sure quite where you step back into the presentation, but
But Kirk, you also went away in responding to Scott's question in the chat, so I think it was very apt.
oh, good. Okay. So did I do a double duty here and address
Yeah,
Scott's
exactly.
question at the same time
Yeah.
inadvertently? All right.
Yeah.
Well, that's always
Luke, did you have some
handy.
more slides that you wanted to share?
all my slides were just slides of failure.
Oh,
And
okay. Well,
yeah,
we all need some of that.
yeah. I guess I could bring it back up because actually I think the slide that I was sharing um was of a hybrid design of what Kirk had there that had failed. And you know, uh it's good to know what you're up against and what risk is.
Not sure if we lost you again, Luke. I see it scrolling through your slides. Are you still there? Oh, it looks like you've muted.
Can you hear me?
Yep, now we can hear you. You bet, you're back.
Okay, I'm just gonna stay off on sharing media. It seems like my connection's not doing great, but I can chat you guys through it. Yeah, essentially, I was gonna share some photographs of when beaver get the upper hand, and figure it out. They're very intelligent mammals. Their capacity to understand water and problem solve is yeah, 30 million years of evolution. And so when they do figure something out, or conditions change. For instance, a risk at Kirk's spot there is that, and Kirk, if I recall, you don't totally dry out in the
That's correct.
summertime.
Yep.
But for instance, at Centralia College, that China Creek that runs right through town totally dries out. And in that process, the cages become exposed, and the water levels change, and the risk goes up. And so, trapezoid cages have been beat. And so, for places like your forest where you might not go out there for a week or two, or more in different seasons, monitoring matters. Coexistence is not a set it and forget it, it's a relationship. And when we're trying to hold back their instincts, um, getting it right in the original build with some experience helps, but monitoring really helps as well to see how they're doing because they can and will work tirelessly to mobilize soil and sticks, and they will, in fact, build organic concrete and bury the whole thing. Um, and yeah, that's the challenge. I was pretty confident after building 20 of them without too many failures, and then I lost two in a row, and now I'm just like, whoa, that's what being a sophomore is all about. Yeah. So, one edit, Kirk, on your concept is that the 6-inch mesh disallows them from swimming through.
Oh, it does.
Yeah, that is a size that there's a real sweet spot. A mature beaver should be too big to get through there. If they could swim through it, they'd get their sticks through it. They're great at pushing sticks through. Um, and your typical like farm store tractor supply 6x8 welded mesh galvanized hog panel, um, is has sometimes proven to be just big enough, um, where that is so commercially available that folks typically go for it, because of ease of acquisition, and then figure out the hard way, that beavers can beat it, or they train their teenagers to just be like, yeah, get in there, kid. Um, and they can beat that. And so where allowed by Fish and Wildlife, particularly in streams where winter steelhead aren't migrating, those large anadromous fish, we use, um, 6x6 remesh, which is a industrial concrete like slab reinforcement welded wire. and just that 6x6 instead of 6x8 has proven to be worthwhile. So, yeah.
Great. Well, that's one reason why I host these fireside chats is they're always beneficial to me and the management of my forest. So learned a couple valuable tips there in the design of this. So um, yeah, well, thank you for that, Luke. I think at this point, with the 15 minutes that we have left, I'd love to open it up for questions, or if, of course, if anybody has any personal beaver anecdotes that they want to share, would love to hear from any of you what you're curious about or dealing with on your own land out there. Anybody care to volunteer a question or an anecdote? And Scott, I'm looking at the question on that you put in the chat, and it sounds like I'm trusting that we addressed that sufficiently. I don't know if you have any other follow up to that, or any other clarification that you're looking for.
No, I just wanted to confirm that the I don't know if it's a trademark or just a name, but the beaver deceivers that I've heard discussed are the same general concept as what Luke's slides presented this evening.
Yeah, well, it's Beaver Deceiver is a trademarked name. And one of the forefathers of beaver coexistence is named Skip Lyle, and he has that trademark. And he will remind you if you use it in a public presentation. Yeah, he's a cool guy. I mean, you can look at his website. He definitely is. He does high quality and has done a lot of innovation. So it is a trademark name.
So a question that comes up in the chat here, can you talk a little more about the relationship between beavers and anadromous fish? What happens if beavers come along and dam up a stream that fish want to come up?
That is the question. That is the question. And it's a great question. For those of us who really care for healthy waterways, the presence of beaver can be it's tough to answer that question. I won't answer that question definitively because we but I will just add content to it. We're stuck in a tough place. Right now, the systems are so depreciated that they don't even look the way that they did when they were before the loss of beaver. And we think of creeks as being these lines and squiggles, but really in these low gradient systems, creeks were hidden deep spots on these connected floodplains that would be sinuously whipping their way from one side of the valley bottom to the other as the years would pass. And fish passage really was a different story. And now that we're so depreciated and agriculture has drained all these fields and creeks have been channelized and incised into these deep spots, something like a beaver dam really seems to represent a fish passage obstruction. And in some ways, it certainly is. And that's where the debate is. But there's also concern that beaver dams increase the temperature of water, thereby threatening fish migration and fish kill in summer months, which is debatable, but a lot of deep science, which is pretty easy to find, shows that 5 times the water that, depending on the content of the soil, how permeable it is, 3 to 5 times the water that beaver dams store above ground is being pushed underground and therefore the net effect of the beaver dam cools the water. It's just that that cool water is emerging downstream. And so when there's one beaver with one dam in a creek, it doesn't have the same effect as if the whole creek was a network of beaver dams that there was more water in than there ever would be were there none. And um, so that's something. And the other consideration, besides the fact that we know that back in the day when the water systems were healthy, fish found a way because there was a lot more water in the system. The forests were a lot more spongy. We didn't clear cut and burn. Trees were just stacked on top of themselves. The level of humus that was storing water, and how many downed trees were all over the place. Like there was just a lot more water in the landscape. But also, um, fish move typically during high water events because there's more water. And so usually the big fish runs that happen, they're just sitting there staging, waiting for those big systems to come through. And so when floods come over, that's when the creeks overwhelm the beaver dams, and there's channels for the fish to make their way over those dams that in low water might seem like the dam is a total obstruction. And so we're in a rock and a hard place right now where it's tough to tell, and it's case by case. You kind of got to look at that specific dam, think of that specific passage, what season are we, and what's going on. And local fish biologists can, lend some light on that, and just knowing your waterways, but it's a really challenging question.
Does anybody else have a question for Luke, or again, a personal anecdote to share? Has anybody had to deal with beaver out there one way or the other?
And another question I would put out there, because here's a captive audience. Would anyone, uh, can anyone report? I'm looking for anecdotes. Do you see a shifting baseline in beaver? Have you been around here for a while? Were you raised here? Are you seeing beaver in places that you haven't seen them before? That's what the numbers tell me, but you guys are the landowners. What's your experience? What are you seeing?
So my experience with beavers is Carkeek Park, where they've dammed up, and I think the city is trying to deal with how do you get the salmon going up Piper Creek still. Apparently, a lot of salmon going through this year. I haven't seen them yet this year, but there are a lot going through. But last year there was a problem with the salmon going through. But it's flooded certain areas and then dried up anything below the dam, of course. So that's been fascinating to see, and we walked there and nice to see. And then the other one is up in the Skagit Valley. We have a little bit of property up there. And beavers were coming across from Fur Island and going up along the dike, the water along the dike, and then it got blocked off for someone who was supposedly putting in a salmon channel that hasn't worked, but it blocked off the beavers and they've not been back, unfortunately. So we know they were there because they knocked down one tree on our land. That's fine. They can have a couple trees. That's fine. But they're blocked off at this point. So we assume they're still around somewhere on Fur Island, but haven't seen them on our side, which is along the Mount Vernon side.
All right.
We're down in the West Hills of Portland. When we moved in onto our property 30 years ago, we had no beaver, and now we have a continuous line of beaver dams on our creek. Some of them are quite noticeable. Others are pretty small, but they're damming the whole creek.
Is that creating some conflict, or is the creek just deep enough that you guys are high and dry?
Oh, we're high and dry. It's we have to keep an eye on our culverts, and the conflict is, they get trees that we don't want them to get. We have to monitor that continuously, but we're trying to coexist.
All right, that's good news to hear. I will offer up Project Beaver has really been focused on creating resources of all different types when it comes to coexistence. If they and just recently released a whole bunch of one-page flyers about tree crop protection. So for those of you who are having tree issues, it seems like a simple concept to just be like throw a cage around it, but there's a lot of ways of doing that right, and there's a lot of ways of doing that wrong. And it's really depressing to put an effort in and have it go wrong because beaver beat it, or it becomes costly because you spent too much money, too much staking, and too much work for how many trees you have. So where's the sweet spot between doing it efficiently and being effective? And so at projectbeaver.org under resources, there's some pretty consolidated wisdom and some pretty tactfully designed PDFs.
I think we share a comment and a question that Scott put into the chat. He said, our forest is on the Solduck River, and we see beavers appear to den under overhanging brush on the margins of the river. Is this common? I'm more used to seeing the typical beaver lodges shown in books.
Yeah, that's very common. The standalone quintessential beaver lodge is a really high input, a high energy way for them to protect themselves. But in places like lakes and rivers where there's steep dens, a big root wad is a pretty high security environment. And so digging into soil and then tucking their home up in the safety of a live tree or an old dead root wad is a really easy way for them to protect themselves against like you're digging coyote type predator. And so the bank den is the easiest. Otherwise, in flat gradient systems, that's where those dens come from. They're stacking sticks up high enough and thick enough that a digging predator hopefully won't be able to get to the inside, but it's a lot of work.
We have time for one last question or comment if anybody has one. If not, I have one last item to share with you all, and while I'm doing that, anybody can still chime in. Just share one last slide. So obviously, you can find all sorts of information on YouTube. Last week, I spent a bit of time just I put in beaver deceiver as a search term into YouTube, and I came across this delightful gentleman, Martin. And Luke, I don't know if you've come across Martin yet, but I have not enjoyed a YouTube video as much as Martin versus the Phantom Beaver in a long time. And Martin is one of those, people that I can really relate to. You can tell that he tries out a lot of things, and most of his learning comes from doing things wrong the first time. That really speaks to my approach to most projects.
Beavers are moving.
And if you want to find Martin's video, the title there is right at the top. I think this is actually the second in a series of videos, but this particular one, I don't think I've laughed as much at anything in a long time as Martin's anecdotes. Tweaking the Beaver Deceiver for water level control is the title of the video. If you want to type that into your YouTube search field there. And that'll be your moment of zen for the evening here if you want to fall asleep to Martin and his anecdotes. But I think on that note, we will call it an evening. Luke with Beaver Craftworks, I really appreciate you joining us this evening, sharing your wisdom, your passion for both forest environmental conservation and certainly bringing beavers back to the Northwest. Doing good work out there, my friend, and glad to know you're doing what you're doing, and really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us. And everybody, again, thank you for joining us for our November Fireside chat. And look forward to seeing you at our next monthly chat. I don't think we've decided what the topic is yet for December, but we'll surprise you.
Yeah.
And,
Or the date, because yeah, we always have to consider how close we're getting to the holidays. So we might have
That's
to
right.
adjust that a little bit, but we will chat. And if anyone has ideas, feel free to send them our way. Outreach at nnrg.org is always open for your questions and comments.
All right. Thanks all for joining us. Thanks again, Luke.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, folks.
Good night.